Tonight on KQED Newsroom, special guest Judge LaDoris Cordell talks about her years on the bench and the insights she's gained into the problems with our criminal justice system. Plus, the Omicron surge and its impact on local hospitals, another contentious recall election, and the 49ers play the Packers on Saturday. We analyze this week's big stories with our panel of reporters. And many of us have played with Legos, but have you seen what this artist can do with these plastic bricks? That's this week's look at something beautiful. Coming to you from KQED headquarters in San Francisco, this Friday, January 21st, 2022. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Priya David Clemens and this is KQED Newsroom. Earlier this week, California logged its 7 millionth case of the coronavirus, adding 1 million cases in just 1 week. Still, there are signs that the Omicron surge is starting to descend from its peak as test positivity rates drop from a high of 23% last week down to 20% this week. But hospitals are still scrambling, and death rates are still nearly double what they were a month ago in California. Joining me now to talk about this is Marin County Public Health Officer Dr. Matt Willis. Dr. Willis, thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So you said this week that the case rate is declining steadily in Marin County. Tell us what you're seeing.
Yeah, we're seeing our cases peaked really in that first week of January. Our highest single day was January 4th. We had almost 700 cases on that day. For context, that's about 7 times the highest number of cases we'd seen in the Delta surge that happened in August.
Wow.
But since then, we've seen steady declines in cases, now steady for the past 10 days, fewer and fewer cases each day. We're about 280 cases now on average each day.
So, Dr. Willis, from what you're seeing, is this trend holding true across the state?
There are some areas that are exceptions to this. I think overall the state is seeing a decline in cases, and this is consistent with what we've seen in other parts of the world where Omicron hit earlier. The UK, New York, Boston, decreases in cases, and that's what we're seeing in the state as a rule by and large, but there are some exceptions. Even in Marin, we have some communities where cases are continuing to increase.
And are those typically among unvaccinated communities or communities with a lower vaccination rate?
That's right. We see a strong correlation between both at the individual level and at the community level. Places and communities and groups of people where vaccination rates are lower are more hard hit. We're seeing, continuing increases in cases in those groups. And then even more importantly, for those who end up in the hospital and those who are passing away, we are starting to see a slight uptick in our death rate as well. It is, unfortunately, among those people who are unvaccinated or who are fully vaccinated but haven't gotten their booster yet and have some of those risk factors for some more severe outcomes, especially older age or chronic medical conditions.
So does this declining case rate then indicate to you that we could see a return to normal at some point soon, meaning life without masks and other restrictions?
Well, yes, that's the hope, right? Everything is driven by the case rates, by the variant, the characteristics of the variant that we're encountering right now. It seems that Omicron is sort of releasing its grasp gently. Right now, we're still, it's important to reckon, we're still seeing 280 new cases a day in Marin County. So this is by no means over, but we are seeing improvement. It's too early to let down our guard. I think if I have any concerns about sharing this as good news, is that people might misunderstand this as the coast is clear and we can go back to normal now. We really need to stay vigilant for the next few weeks at least. Omicron is not the common cold. We are seeing people coming into hospitals, especially people who are not vaccinated. Our infrastructure, our hospitals, our healthcare, our schools are still under stress in terms of the workforce. And then importantly, we don't know the long-term consequences of Omicron infection in terms of long COVID are not yet well described. So these are all important reasons why we need to continue to do things to prevent infections, at least for the next few weeks.
And what would it take for you to say you're not worried anymore?
Well, I don't know that I'm ever going to be able to say that because we know that it's been 2 years. This variant has demonstrated that it mutates very quickly. New variants have new characteristics. We've now had multiple waves globally. We would expect there will be others. Unfortunately, we've gone through Alpha, Delta, Omicron. we will have new variants. I think most experts recognize that's likely. So I think we'll still need to remain vigilant, but I think we can feel confident that we have the tools now. We've learned a lot about this virus. We know how to adapt. Vaccines are incredibly effective tools for us, and we know how to make the best use of them. Especially in the Bay Area, we're very fortunate that we have a highly vaccinated community.
We are indeed. Yep. Yeah. Thank you so much, Marin County Public Health Officer Dr. Matt Willis. We appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We turn now to a California judge who shattered glass ceilings when she became the first African-American female judge in Northern California. Judge LaDoris Hazzard Cordell is calling out America's criminal justice system for racial and ethnic bias, which study after study has also revealed. She says the courts regularly punish people of color more severely than white people, and she has plenty of ideas for how to fix injustices in the system. Cordell, now retired, shares her insights in her recent book, Her Honor: My Life on the Bench, What Works, What's Broken, and How to Change It. Judge Cordell joins us by Skype from Palo Alto. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Priya.
So tell us, what was it like being the first and then one of very few female black judges in the region?
At the time I went on the bench, which was in the early 1980s, I was the first black female judge in all of Northern California. Think about that, just 1982. Today, there's this plethora of judges of color and women on these TV shows, the court shows, but there are also many more. But at the time that I came on, there were very few people that looked like me and very few women. And the concern I had is that, and still have, because we still need to do more, it's that representation on the bench is so important. And I mean a diversity of representation. When you have people from different backgrounds coming in, their decisions they make, I believe, are more informed. And, when we see people in our courtrooms that look like us, the people who are in the courtrooms feel like they have a stake in the system, that they can maybe even aspire to hold positions like this. So diversity and representation is just tremendously important in our legal system, as well as any other system in this country.
Now, your book title starts with What Works. So let's tuck into that for a minute. What is the good stuff that you love in our justice system?
We have the best legal system in the world because it is based upon these wonderful principles. The principles of we're all created equal, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Everyone has a right to a speedy jury trial, a right against self-incrimination, a right to due process. These principles were promulgated by property white males who did not contemplate, however, that these principles would apply to women, to poor people, and to people of color. So the problem in the legal system has been with the implementation of these principles. And what we have is an unequal, unjust, and unfair implementation, and that's where the work comes in.
So you think the basic tenets of our legal system work, but the implementation leads to the next element in your title, what's broken. So let's talk about that, and let's specifically start by talking about racism in the system and how you saw it over your years.
Right. So anyone who doesn't believe that racism is not baked into the system can just, first of all, look at the numbers. And we can look at the numbers of people who are incarcerated, who are prosecuted, tend to be more people of color, black and brown people. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And what I do is focus in the book on some of those reasons and then propose in a chapter called The Fix a way to deal with it. So, one example where racism is just glaring in our legal system is with peremptory challenges. So peremptory challenges allowed each side in a criminal case or a civil case to excuse potential jurors for any reason or for no reason at all, as long as they haven't done so because of the person's race, gender, sexual orientation, or religion. And each side in a case gets a defined number of these challenges. And the U.S. Supreme Court has said that peremptory challenges are okay, but they can't be racially motivated. However, Thurgood Marshall called peremptory challenges the greatest embarrassment in our criminal justice system. And he said that because in a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court called Batson versus Kentucky, and I talk about it in the book, the court has said when a peremptory challenge is questioned that the person who did the challenge has to give a race-neutral explanation for removing the juror, but then it's up to the judge to determine if that explanation is plausible. And more than 30 years after Batson, trial judges continue to accept superficial and, in my view, outright ridiculous race-neutral excuses, usually from prosecutors for their peremptory challenges. And Thurgood Marshall once again said, any prosecutor can easily assert facially neutral reasons for striking a juror, and trial courts are ill-equipped to second-guess those reasons.
Judge Cordell, you talk in the book here about how racism used to be the elephant in the courtroom. Could you give us an example of that from your own life, from what you've seen?
Sure. So when I was on the bench, and really this has gone up until recently, race was always there, but nobody talked about it. And indeed, I write about in the book when I was in a judges meeting and brought up the subject when we were deciding that we wanted to do a search to find someone to be a commissioner on the court. And commissioners do the work of judges, but they're appointed by judges. And when I brought up the subject, let us make this search one where we reach out to people of color and to really make sure we can have a more diverse bench, I was just dumped on. People got real upset, my fellow colleagues, not all of them, but a large number of them, and said, the fact that you're bringing it up is just racist. No, not at all. Well, that's all changed today, and because of Black Lives Matter movement, especially since the murder of George Floyd, it's no longer the elephant in the courtroom. Not only should we talk about it, but judges especially have to do something about it.
Let's go to a national story. In November, a jury acquitted Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot and killed 2 people during a riot in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Generally, people seem to have accepted the decision as fair because it followed the laws of the state. Do you agree that the verdict was the right one?
I have a real problem with, it's not so much the verdict because, again, there are certain laws in a state that are different from, say, the laws here in California with regard to self-defense and with regard to arming oneself. What I have a problem with was the conduct of the judge. I have a chapter in my book called Bad Judges, and had I written this book a little later, I would have included the judge in the Kyle Rittenhouse case in that chapter. His behavior, both verbal and nonverbal behavior, gave a message to the jurors that he sided with Kyle Rittenhouse. His rulings were such that he was just angry and yelling at prosecutors and very kind to defense attorneys. And that's just problematic. Judges should never, ever do that. We should be the neutral ones who are being fair to both sides, and I don't think that happened in the case.
So then I think this brings us to sort of this final section in your book title about how to change some of the problems in our system. For example, what can people do when they see judges behaving in ways that they think are not appropriate?
So in the chapter, The Fix, I have 10 recommendations about how to make this legal system work better. And in answer to your question, Priya, there's a recommendation about what we should do about judges, about the disciplining of judges and letting people know that they have a right to speak up and to make complaints against judges. And I describe the whole system. There are just a variety of ways in which we can change it and make the system better. And one of them, as I mentioned earlier about peremptory challenges, California is leading the country in getting it right. In September 2020, our governor signed a racial justice act that was proposed by Assemblyman Ashkara. And that law is geared to getting the racism out of our criminal legal system. And really specifically calls out judges and say when you hear, for example, race-neutral answers given in challenges on peremptory challenges, it's on you, judges. Don't just rubber stamp it. Dig deep, and if you need to, hold special hearings to determine exactly what is the motivation for prosecutors getting rid of, for example, jurors of color. So we're making some headway, and California is leading the nation.
You have several more ideas in the book. I recommend people pick it up if they want to hear those. For example, one problem you see is that jurors are paid only $15 a day for serving on state court cases after the first day. But in the interest of time, we only have another 30 seconds or so left. You also talk about the importance of public intervention, of public outcry. Could you just share with us an example recently about how you've seen that play out?
Sure. The biggest example, the most recent one, is that the case of Britney Spears. And for 13 plus years, those hearings about her conservatorship were held in secret. The public didn't know. But once the public got access and we saw what was happening in the courtroom, everything flipped. The judge did a 180 and the conservatorship ended. Nothing changed in that conservatorship for the judge to change the ruling, other than that with transparency, we are able to hold those who participate in these proceedings accountable. And because of that, the change came in the conservatorship of Britney Spears. That is a glaring and just a great example about how our courts need to be transparent and open to the public.
Judge LaDoris Hazzard Cordell, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Despite the good news that COVID cases are declining, the impact of the pandemic continues to be felt everywhere. Governor Gavin Newsom and some lawmakers are looking to increase workplace COVID vaccine mandates and even remove the personal belief exemption. Joining us now to discuss this week's big stories are KQED politics and government reporter Guy Marzorati. Hi, Guy.
Hey, Priya.
And KQED morning radio news anchor Brian Watt. Welcome, Brian.
Hello.
So, Guy, let's start with you. Tell us how the legislature and the governor are responding to the ongoing pandemic, and also how it's come up in a state assembly race.
Right. I mean, largely to this point, California's response to the pandemic has been driven by Governor Gavin Newsom, whether it's the regulations that were debated in last year's recall campaign, the billions he's proposing in this year's budget for tests, for masks. But as we know from Schoolhouse Rock, right, it's going to take legislative action to make more permanent change. And I actually think, to your point, we're starting to see the legislature make some moves. There was a working group convened this week of assembly members and senators to look at vaccine rules. And actually, one of those members, State Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco, introduced a bill today to eventually let kids 12 and up get vaccinated without parental consent. I think really the big question is the legislature going to take on this personal belief exemption that allows some kids to get out of taking COVID vaccines? Look, this came up in the legislature over measles a few years ago, and things got really ugly, right? And I think likely there's going to be, protests at the Capitol, potentially disruptive if this comes up again. And I think, for Democrats, it's not a total slam dunk issue. It sounds, from a debate that I moderated for a state assembly race here in San Francisco for Democrats last week, only one, Bilal Mahmoud, would say, I guarantee that I will work to get rid of a personal belief exemption for COVID vaccines. So it will, I think, be a controversial issue if and when it comes up in the legislature.
Also interesting as we start to move more towards the virus becoming endemic, as the governor just spoke about this week. Brian, you spoke with an ER doctor this week about the personal toll of caring for patients who are showing up at hospitals with severe cases of COVID, most of whom are unvaccinated. What are you hearing that it's like for healthcare professionals?
Well, there is an enormous sense of burnout. First of all, the ER doctor that I spoke to this week actually has quit. Loved this work that she had been doing for almost 20 years, got through the first year to 18 months of the pandemic with a real sense of purpose. But there is this sense that since the vaccination has been available to all adults, and as it slowly became more available to younger people, it has gotten harder and harder for the healthcare workers on the front line to just keep showing up without feeling a little bit defeated. This ER doctor I spoke to had essentially lost an unhealthy amount of weight working so hard and an unhealthy amount of sleep, and just decided that it was okay for her to walk away. And it had a lot to do with treating people who had chosen not to get the vaccine. Those are the people who are showing up to the hospitals now who need hospitalization. And this has been tough. Speaking to a nurse at some point in the last couple of weeks and a respiratory therapist, these kinds of folks, these workers are in a position where they've got to work extra hours or they're leaving colleagues in the lurch. And this has just gotten hard and overwhelming for a lot of people.
Yeah, thanks for that insight, Brian. Guy, nationally, it looks like Democrats may lose the House in the midterm elections, and that's impacting who's running for Congress here in California. What are some of the interesting races you're watching?
Well, it really is impacting, for a lot of sitting members of Congress. We saw just this week Congressman Jerry McNerney, he's represented parts of Contra Costa County since 2007, decide not to run again in November for a 9th term. I think you're seeing it for, members all across the country, Democrats who feel like we might lose the House. If you're living in California, do you want to be flying across the country every week to serve in the minority? To answer your question about interesting races, I think it's going to be in the same places that we've seen in California, the Central Valley, Orange County. That hasn't changed from 2018 or 2020. What really has changed, though, is that states like Texas, other battlegrounds, have continued down a path, especially in Republican-controlled legislatures, of gerrymandering, of making sure there's fewer and fewer competitive seats. So, Priya, California might be really the last battleground left in the nation. I think that's not only good news for politics watchers like you and me, but also, for residents in places like Garden Grove, Santa Clarita, Bakersfield, who really will see contests on the ballot in November with a real vigorous exchange of ideas.
Guy, just very briefly, you've also been watching local politics. We can't do the show this week without talking about early voting having begun in the San Francisco School Board recall. Interestingly, some non-citizens can vote on this ballot. How's this possible?
Right. This is actually a policy put in place by San Francisco voters. They approved it back in 2016. It's now been extended, giving parents and guardians who are non-citizens an opportunity to vote in school board elections. We're seeing, a high watermark this year. It's not a huge number, but 86 as of last week non-citizens in SF had registered to vote in this recall election. I think largely that's probably attributable to the fact that this recall has invigorated so many parents, both for and against, to get involved and, yes, ultimately vote.
Another big story this week was the volcano that erupted near Tonga, which sent those tsunami warnings and slightly higher waves to us here in California. Brian, you've been speaking with Tongans here about how they're working to send help home.
Yeah, and I think that the key in this moment for Tongans in the Bay Area, who honestly have had to come to the aid of their country before, send relief home. This time, they have to be super smart about it. And a lot of that has to do with COVID-19. Tonga has mainly kept that virus out of its country, essentially by keeping people out, by not letting outsiders into Tonga. And I think they might have had one case really since the pandemic. So that makes getting relief efforts into Tonga very hard. So I spoke to the executive director of a Tongan organization based in San Mateo. She said they're thinking really, really carefully about how to get these supplies, trying to be really, really smart. Water is a key priority, drinking water especially, because ash covered so much in Tonga, but also the seas flooded into the drinking water wells that they have in Tonga. So this is a top priority. And so they're being smart. There is also a company based in the Port of Oakland that is sending 2 ships with supplies. They're used to shipping to Tonga. This takes weeks, but one of those ships leaves Friday, another leaves on February 5th, and they're gathering up water, perishable supplies, and N95 masks.
Right. All right, we'll see how those supplies go. Guy, Vice President Kamala Harris was in California today to talk about federal funding for fighting wildfires. What can you tell us about this federal funding?
Right, so the vice president spoke today in San Bernardino, really highlighting investments that were part of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that the president signed last year. This is really about helping California and other places recover after wildfires. So whether that's repairing infrastructure, cleaning up debris, I think the administration clearly has ambitions beyond that to deal with the climate change that is really making these fires much worse. It just remains to be seen how much appetite there is in the U.S. Senate to make those kind of investments going forward.
Brian, just in the last 30 seconds we have here, the San Francisco 49ers play their biggest game in a couple years on Saturday. They're heading out to Green Bay to face off against the Packers, who are favored to win. What's your prediction? Does it end this weekend, or do they have a shot to win the Super Bowl?
Oh, I am awful at predicting anything, especially when it comes to football. But I will say this about the 49ers. They have to be the absolute worst team to prepare to play against They have had a very volatile season at the quarterback position and really across the board, but they have found a way to get this far into the playoffs, given the season that they had, winning their first 2 games, losing the next 4, up and down, all the way to scratching into the playoffs, beating Dallas, a huge foe in the history of the 49ers in the wild card game. That just getting this far has meant a lot to the old school Niner fans who've been following this team for a long time.
Thanks for the insight, Brian Watt and Guy Marzorati, both with KQED. Thanks for your time.
Thanks
You're
so
welcome.
much.
This week's look at something beautiful is the art of the brick. The exhibit features 70 sculptures made from more than 1 million Lego bricks by artist Nathan Sawaya. You can learn more at artofthebrick.com. That's the end of our show for tonight. Thank you as always for joining us. If you want to get a look behind the scenes, then please hang out with us online too. KQED Newsroom is on Twitter and Facebook, and you can email us at knr@kqed.org. You can always reach me on Twitter at Priya D. Clemens. We'll see you right back here next Friday night. Have a great weekend, everybody.